directing the government to return him.
And we're live.
There were a couple of
Instagram Live, YouTube Live, here we are.
The first was a status that Gabriel Garcia had in the United States, protecting him from being deported to El Salvador. In 2019, an immigration judge granted him what is called withholding of removal, meaning that he could not be deported to El Salvador over fear of persecution, even though he could still be deemed removable just to any other country that wasn't El Salvador. Well, fast forward to last month when he was detained by Immigration and Customs Enforcement and then shortly thereafter deported to El Salvador to a notorious prison there. Now, the administration has maintained that he has ties to the gang MS-13. His attorneys and his family say that is not the case, and that too came up during the course of the hearing. The judge asking for more evidence in this case, and the Justice Department attorney saying that the government was not producing any additional evidence beyond what was already in court documents. And insofar as it relates to that gang, those documents date back to 2019 during his immigration proceedings. Now, again, this was a significant case because it was an admission by the federal government that they had sent someone mistakenly to that notorious prison in El Salvador. Recall that they have also sent Venezuelan migrants to that same prison. That is the subject of another case. And the attorneys saying after the hearing that this was a victory, but they note that the administration could still seek to appeal. The real victory will be when Gabriel Garcia is able to come home. His wife was also in the courtroom. She having some level of relief with this ruling, but of course, there's a lot that can still happen between now and Monday if the administration is to appeal. But the key part of all of this that the attorneys and the family have said over and over again is that the administration did concede that they made an error here. Therefore, they're hopeful that they won't try to seek appeal. Lastly, the administration had previously said that they can't return Gabriel Garcia back because he is in Salvadoran custody. Well, the judge wasn't keen on that, noting, of course, the administration has provided millions of dollars to El Salvador to detain these migrants. Therefore, she said it should be available to the U.S. government to transfer back.
Wendy Cutler is a former acting deputy U.S. Trade Representative and current Vice President of the Asian Society Policy Institute. Thank you for taking the time to join us. First, your response to the president once again stepping into what has always been an independent body, and that is the Federal Reserve, suggesting not so subtly that Fed Chair Powell should begin cutting rates now.
Administration conceding in a court filing that it had mistakenly deported Gabriel Garcia to El Salvador, the Salvadoran national who is a resident of Maryland, and the administration saying that it was because of, quote, an administrative error. Now, 2 days later, we're ending a week with a ruling from a federal judge directing the government to return him to the United States. There were a couple of key points that came up over the course of the hearing. The first was a status that Gabriel Garcia had in the United States, protecting him from being deported to El Salvador. In 2019, an immigration judge granted him what is called withholding of removal, meaning that he could not be deported to El Salvador over fear
within just a couple of quarters'
even though he
time,
could still
we're
be
going to have a
removable just
completely
to any other
restructured,
country that wasn't El
reorganized
Salvador. Well, fast forward
economic
to last
utopia
month when
here in the
he
United
was
States
detained
with
by
reshoring
Immigration
and more
Customs
jobs
Enforcement, and then shortly
higher
thereafter
paying jobs
deported
coming back
to
the
El Salvador
United
to
States.
a
Just
notorious
give us
prison
your
there.
sense
Now,
of
the
the
administration
likelihood
has
and
maintained
how
that
realistic
he has ties
that
to the gang
possibility is.
MS-13. His attorneys and his family say that is not the case, and that too came up during the course of the hearing. The judge asking for more evidence in this case, and the Justice Department attorney saying that the government was not producing any.
And not be dependent on foreign countries who cheat us. But in reality, we're in a world of complex global supply chains. Our consumers
Additional
have
evidence
used
beyond
to
what was
lower
already in court
prices
documents,
have,
and insofar as it relates to that gang,
benefits from
those
this
documents dating
international
back
trading
to
system.
2019
Clearly,
during
adjustments
immigration
need to be made,
proceedings.
and I'm all
Now,
in
again,
favor of making
this
more at
was
home.
a significant
But
case.
I don't think has to be an all or nothing proposition. We need to find that proper balance of working with other countries, trading, investing with other countries, while still focusing on America
It was an
as well
admission
and
by the
our
federal
own
government that they had sent
manufacturing,
someone mistakenly to that
and
notorious prison
services,
in El Salvador.
R&D
Recall
capabilities.
Heads or tails, it's a simple feat of tossing a coin and it gives you a seemingly random outcome. I know you think it's going to be 50, but you know what I'm talking about. Actually,
although they have also
researchers
sent
are now
Venezuelan
saying
migrants to that same prison. That is the subject of another case. And the attorney.
Generating truly random numbers have perplexed computer scientists for years. Quantum computing may provide the answer to many of the world's problems, and as Stuart has been looking into it.
What is
saying
a
after
random
the
number
hearing
truly
that this was
random?
a
Contrary to the
victory,
name,
but
computer-generated random numbers are not truly random because they rely on predictable algorithms. Mathematicians and computer scientists have been searching for a way to create a
that the
truly
administration could
random
still
number.
seek to
And now
appeal.
the
And the real
quantum
victory will
computing
be
company
when
Quintillion
Guimaraes Garcia
claims it
is
has
able to
successfully
come home. His
produced a
wife is
number
also in the courtroom.
certified
She
as being
having some
random. How
level
can
of
quantum
relief with
computers
this
do what
ruling, but of
conventional
course,
computers can't? Well, it's based on something called superposition. Our computers process information in the form of bits, which can either be 1 or 0. Quantum computers use quantum bits or qubits, which
there's
can
a lot that
embody
can still
0
happen between
and
now
1 to
and
varying
Monday if the
degrees
administration
at the same time. Think of it like flipping a coin. Classical bits are
to
the flipped
appeal. But
coin,
the key part
heads
of all
or
of this that
tails.
the attorneys and the family have
Qubits
said
are the
over and over
coin
again
as it's
is that the
flipping,
administration
which
did
has a
concede
probability
that they
of
made an
being
error
heads
here.
or
Therefore, they're
tails.
hopeful that they
This
won't try to
qubit
seek
property
appeal.
is known
Lastly,
as
the administration
superposition.
had previously
It
said that
allows
they
quantum
can't return
computers to solve complex
Arellano Garcia
problems
back
in
because he is in
minutes.
Salvadoran custody. Well, the judge wasn't keen on that, noting, of course, that the administration has provided millions of
It's a
dollars to El
capability
Salvador
that
to
many
detain
are
these
racing to
migrants.
utilize.
Therefore,
In
she
recent
said,
months, Google, Microsoft, and Amazon presented new quantum computing chips. In December, China unveiled its newest quantum computer
it should be
with a
available to the U.S. government to ask for
504
that.
qubit
Wendy
chip,
Cutler is a former
beating
acting
previous
deputy U.S.
500
Trade
qubit
Representative and the
threshold.
current vice president of
While
the Asian
quantum
Society
computers
Policy
have high
Institute. She's
potential,
joining me now.
they
Wendy,
are
thank you.
very prone to error, since the delicate qubits can be jostled by even a subatomic particle. They require highly controlled environments.
Taking the time to join us. First, your response to the president once again stepping into what has always been an independent body, and that is the Federal Reserve.
Being able to make chips that are big enough to perform relevant computation.
A research team at Oxford is
that
addressing
Chair
the
Powell should begin
scalability
cutting rates
problem.
now.
They recently demonstrated the first
Well,
instance
I
of
think the president
distributed
is
quantum
closely
computing.
watching not only
This
the markets, the
process links
interest rates,
small
the
quantum
economy.
devices together, allowing computations to be distributed across a network.
The advantage to this is that you can then preserve the reduced complexity of the smaller quantum processor while still being able to get
looking at all of this, and
processors
he's
to
telling
act together
Americans that
for
we
one
should
single
basically
fully connected quantum computer.
It's a step toward practical, large-scale quantum computing, which most experts believe will still take years, and could eventually reinvent various industries and scientific research, solving
sacrifice
problems
short-term
in
pain for
medicine,
long-term gain.
chemistry,
I'm not sure he actually
cybersecurity,
believes
and
that. And
artificial
so he's
intelligence.
looking for ways
But
to kind
for
of push
now, at least, it can create a legitimate random number. Anna Stewart, CNN.
the blow to American consumers and the American public with these tariffs.
Devil May Cry HD
What is this long-term gain that we're hearing not just from the president, but from his top advisors and cabinet officials that will ultimately come? I mean, they're forecasting within just a couple of quarters' time, we're going to have a completely restructured, reorganized economic utopia here in the United States.
From game screens to streaming screens.
What kind of work do you do exactly?
With reshoring and more jobs and higher paying jobs coming back to the United States. Just give us your sense of the likelihood and how
Addie and I
realistic
worked together on
that
a movie.
possibility is.
What was it?
2014.
2014.
Well,
It
my
was a long
sense
time
is that
ago.
the president and his
He was
advisors
an
see
actor
in
in the
America.
film, and we hit it off really, really well. And he was talking about Devil May Cry back then.
Where we could make everything at home and become more of a
So I checked
manufacturing
it out back
powerhouse
then only
and not
because
be
of, you know,
dependent on
because of
foreign
that.
countries
But
to
I
feed us.
definitely,
But in reality, we're in a
bought all
world-
of the games when I found out that I got the part, and I've been playing. Am I good? No, but I am trying.
How does the show's creator describe the
The
world of
complex
Devil May
global
Cry?
supply chains, our consumers have gotten used to lower prices and have secured benefits from
entire army. Sounds easy enough. Let's dance.
Leveling up in Hollywood, I'm Rick Damicello.
Looking to save on internet or
International
mobile?
trading
Get the best
system.
of both
Look,
with
clearly
Xfinity.
adjustments
Because now you
need
can
to be
get
made,
Xfinity
and I'm all in
with
favor.
unlimited mobile included for $25 a month for the first year and get a free 5G phone. Switch today. Xfinity.
On Holland America, you'll get a taste for the art of leisurely travel. A taste of Europe's iconic landmarks. And a taste for locally sourced and artfully prepared dishes. With experiences too good to hurry through. There are many ways to experience Europe, but only one way to truly savor it. Holland America. Savor the journey.
Making more at home, but I don't think has to be an all or nothing proposition. We need to find that proper balance of working with other countries, trading, investing with other countries, while still focusing on America as well and our own manufacturing and services, R&D capabilities.
Heads or tails, it's a simple thing across the coin and it gives you a seemingly random outcome. I know. I think it's a bit different, you know what I'm talking about. Actually, researching now saying even tiny
It's
factors.
interesting the president chose to go play golf today. I mean, does he?
I think long ago he stepped down about certain objects and he's made very clear that he's presidency, he's going to do what he wants. And, it's not just playing golf. He went down to a Saudi-backed golf tournament that his family business does business with. Just to give some of that related to that. So, yes, all of this.
And did not go to
What is a random number?
return of service.
Three,
Did not go to the
contrary to
transfer
the
of
name,
the
computer-generated random
transfer
numbers
names of those fallen service members. He is not messaging this in a way that suggests that he understands what average people might be going through right now.
because they
Part of
rely
what
on predictable
it is he
algorithms.
is convinced he is right. He is convinced he's going to show people he is right. He has believed in terrorists for 40 years. He wanted to do this last time, and he was stymied by a bunch of advisors who were much more for free trade. And now he's gonna do what he's gonna do. He's doing it in a very different economy, post-COVID. He is doing it on a much broader scale with these tariffs, and I think most significantly, Anderson, with a formula that does not make sense to a lot of people. That, once people were looking at what this formula was, it was difficult to comprehend. It's difficult for people in the administration to explain, and they will acknowledge that privately. So whether any of this impacts him and his approval numbers, I think is the question. If it starts to, they will possibly see a change. One other thing that is likely to see a rise, coffee prices. They're already pretty high, but they're expected to heat up even more once these tariffs kick in. Keep in mind, the world's largest suppliers of raw coffee beans are now facing tariffs of up to 46%. And just as the costs in the deli are going to get passed along, you could expect those costs will have to be passed along as well. Importers, supermarkets, coffee shops, consumers. Brazil, Vietnam, and Colombia are the largest exporters of coffee in the world. CNN contributor Stefano Poncevan is in Bogota, Colombia, with a closer look at this. Look, they must be bracing because there is so much concern about how expensive that cup of Joe is going to be.
This is process information in the form
Yes, exactly.
of
I think Richard made a very valid point. Yesterday, I was thinking around the same lines of, the focus has been mostly on car tariffs, for example, and we're talking about a 25% import of cars. But how many times in your lifetime you purchase a new car? Well, instead, everybody drinks a lot of coffee. I personally am around the 3 or 4 cups of espresso. That's what I drink, and if that adds up 10% on each single cup, that makes a massive difference. We're coming to you live, and I wish, Erica, you could be here, because the aroma that is coming out of these massive warehouses, this coffee scent, is just amazing. This is where Colombia stores its coffee before exporting it to the rest of the world. It's the true gold of Colombia. And just last almost 5 of these sacks are taking these warehouses out of the United States. The largest purchaser of coffee from Colombia is the United States, about 40%. And about 27% of the coffee Americans drink every year comes from around here. So yes, there is a strong concern about the impact. Just as it's only 10%. It's not as big as Vietnam, for example, which is 46%, and is on the line with the rest of other coffee even this can make a massive impact on the economy eventually. Here is the final product. This is the coffee. Shortly, these beans will be going to a deli in New York, where my friend Richard West might be having his morning fix. Whether he will pay for the correct or who will pay for that remains to be seen. Erica?
Yeah, absolutely. And you're right, by the way. I would love to be a little because like you, I also love my home. I appreciate it. Thank you.
President Trump's tariffs
since March 2020. That's the start of the COVID pandemic lockdowns in 2020, according to the Economic Policy Uncertainty Index. Those initial lockdowns, although people were saying it was important when it came to saving lives, they also had costs. Public health policies we were asked to abide by would, one wonders what the effect would be on the economy, on our mental health, on the education of our kids, and so much more. There's a new book called In COVID's Wake, How Our Politics Failed Us, that examines all that and more. And joining us now are the authors, Princeton University professors Francis Lee and Stephen Macedo. Stephen, I remember just like poking my head up during COVID coverage and saying, are we really sure we should be closing the schools? And I was bombarded with tweets from teachers. I wanted to kill them. Yeah. Were you worried at all about writing this book? About people like saying, you know, what are you doing?
We were, and we worry about it, especially with the current attacks on the university, and attacks on science and defunding and so on. But we think that, you know, a premise of those attacks is that universities are politicized, science are politicized, and if we're not willing to ask hard questions, you know, then we would tend to support that premise. And we think by asking hard questions, being willing to address hard questions and admit past mistakes, we'll have to defy that premise and improve.
There needs to be a reckoning, and well, let's talk about the education thing, because it seems like kids are still reeling from this, right? I mean, these NAEP scores didn't go down just on their own. I mean, obviously, the United States has been struggling with education for a while. But how much do you think some of the struggles we're seeing in our schools today are because of schools being basically shut down? I mean, like this virtual learning, I have skepticism. I'm skeptical of how much it did anything.
So we have seen unprecedented drop in student learning since the pandemic.
I mean, like this virtual learning,
the time series is quite remarkable when you look at the indicators and the severe damage that was done to student learning in the aftermath. But there has been a lack of recovery in great part because absenteeism in school has also skyrocketed in the wake of the pandemic.
I'm skeptical of how much it did anything.
Nationwide. People began to feel, young people and parents began to feel that school, attendance at school was to some extent optional. And so, people's habits changed in many ways during the pandemic, including young people. And so it's hard to catch up
learning since the pandemic.
Lost learning when you're actually attending school less.
The time series is quite remarkable.
One of the ways I kind of look at
the indicators
today, I do not mean
the
this
severe
in an
damage that was
unsympathetic
done.
way, I mean it entirely sympathetic, is I almost feel like they're emotionally about 2 or 3 years behind where people 20 years ago would have been, whether like a college freshman at age 18 might really emotionally be at about a 16-year-old level. Is that fair?
Well, I mean, we've seen some of that. Our students are very privileged at Princeton. We both teach at Princeton University.
Yeah.
So, you know, I think our students have done a good job of recovering. But as Francis said, there
also skyrocketed in the wake of the pandemic.
Why do you think that is?
High rates of depression, absenteeism. And another very sad thing here is that this was all predicted during COVID pandemic planning documents. There were vivid metrics of the cost of these measures that we implemented, including school closures. And those measures, those pre-COVID pandemic plans, said that we were extremely unlikely to be effective at curtailing the amount of mortality from COVID, the amount of morbidity from COVID. We didn't pay attention to those, which is a real shame.
Francis, one of the moments I had personally a real crisis of faith in our health institutions and medical institutions when after the George Floyd protests, and look, the murder of George Floyd was a horrible moment, and I'm glad that there was awareness
in an unsympathetic way, I mean entirely sympathetic, is I almost feel like they're emotionally
all of a sudden,
about 2 or 3
even
years
though kids were allowed to go to school,
where
playgrounds were locked up, people weren't allowed to go to beaches, et cetera, all of a sudden medical organizations were saying it was okay to gather in large groups in tight spaces to protest racial injustice. And just as a medical justification, it didn't make any sense to me.
that was a time when many people began to question the mandates and to wonder
People
why one could
20 years ago would
go
have
to the
been,
liquor
whether it's
store
like,
or go to a casino and not go to church. You know, the rationality of a lot of the restrictions began to be questioned. We began to see that's in the summer of 2020. That's when the pandemic begins to polarize along partisan lines. It was not party polarized initially. Initially, there was broad adherence to these early recommendations for closures.
Yeah.
So starting mid-March, it's over the summer when you begin to see the states go their different ways. The red states go in one way, blue states go in another, and so then that partisanship begins to structure the
might really emotionally
response
be
to
at
the
about
pandemic after and public opinion
16-year-old
around
level.
it.
Is that
And
fair?
so the kinds of questions that were getting raised around the Floyd protests, that's just one set of questions.
Yeah.
There were many others that tended to break along partisan lines.
I could spend 5 hours talking about this with you guys, but instead I'm going to it's late. How our politics go. Francis Lee and Stephen Macedo. Thanks to both of you.
This is when the 85-minute building. Scouts are going to lead us out, and I'm bringing up the rear. Hot smoke. Smoke out?
With Hollywood portrayals of war films or things of that nature, I think that there's a melody or a rhythm that filmmaking can kind of fall into where nothing boring happens.
Well, I think our students have done a good job of recovering.
And that these men
but as Francis said,
have to fill that
there's plenty of evidence.
And the contrast between being idle and bored and then being in a very perilous, dangerous situation is quite interesting.
Anything that we kind of executed or recreated in the film that you see was learned, directly from vets and former SEAL team members. Boot camp did two things for us. It gave us a kind of condensed sort of technical skill set in order to kind of play a Navy SEAL, and it also bonded us all in an amazing way.
3-week boot camp, I mean, even throughout filming, it was 6 a.m., 6 p.m. every day. Breakfast, lunch, and dinner.
With high rates of depression, absenteeism. And another very sad thing here is that this was all predicted in pre-COVID pandemic.
Something that was more of a symbolic kind of
expression. There was one of the doctors measures that were implemented in school closures. And those measures for pre-COVID pandemic plan. Unlike moments I had a real crisis of faith in our health institutions and medical institutions when after the George Floyd protest, somewhat the murder of George Floyd was a horrible moment, and I'm glad that there was awareness of brutality and all the rest and social inequities, but all of a sudden, even though kids weren't allowed to go to school, playgrounds were locked up, people weren't allowed to go to beaches, et cetera, all of a sudden medical organizations were saying it was okay to gather in large groups in tight spaces to protest racial injustice. And just as a medical justification, it didn't make any sense to me.
That was a time when many people began to question the mandates and to wonder why one could go to the liquor store or go to a casino and not go to church. You know, the rationality of a lot of the restrictions began to be questioned. We began to see that in the summer of 2020, that's when the pandemic began to polarize on partisan lines. It was not party polarized initially. Initially, there was broad adherence to these early recommendations for closure.
This is what it looks like inside a Mexican factory that's been making and sending car parts to the United States for more than 70 years.
The red states go in one way, blue states go in another. And so then that partisanship begins to structure the response to the pandemic after and public opinion around the pandemic. And so
that's the kind of questions that were getting raised around the Floyd protest. That's just one set of questions. There are many others that tend to break along partisan lines.
I could spend 5 hours talking about this with you guys, but instead I'm going to read your book. It's called In COVID Wait, How Our Politics Failed Us. Professors Francis Lee and Stephen Macedo, thanks to both of you. Thanks for writing this book. Really, that's important.
Companies consented to invest in domestic production and generate jobs. Lo que estamos viendo. And people are experiencing a situation that can also become dramatic. That having our own technology allows you to better manage your next steps as a country. Mexican companies now thinking of ways to expand domestically rather than across the border.
And then being a very perilous, dangerous situation is quite interesting.
Anything that we kind of executed.
Fencer Stephanie Turner was disqualified from a tournament after refusing to compete against her opponent, who she says is transgender. The official actually issuing her a black card, which means that she couldn't compete for the rest of the USA fencing sanctioned tournament at the University of Maryland. Turner went on to Fox News to explain her actions.
I was refusing to fence because this person is a man and I am a woman, and this is a women's tournament, and I refuse to fence on Facebook.
USA Fencing told CNN it enacted its transgender non-binary policy in 2023 to expand access to the sport of fencing and create inclusive, safe spaces, and that the disqualification followed international federation rules because Turner, quote, declined to fence an eligible opponent. CNN is not naming Turner's opponent, who has not responded to CNN's request for a comment and who has not publicly commented or disclosed their gender identity.
In an amazing way. 3-week boot camp. I mean, even throughout filming, it was 6 a.m., 6 p.m. Breakfast, lunch, and dinner, we were really just this family. And the tattoo call on me was just like, something that was more of a symbolic kind of expression that just represented our bond, and wherever we are in the world, we can just, our thing is you call on me.
I'm the CEO of Body, and Body is an outlet. And I want to help you love your body and be able to live the life you want with a major discount on our total solution number. This is $129.95 at bodysandI.com. Choose Advil Liquid Gel.
So she has a black eye on her POF.
And longer lasting relief than Tylenol Rapid Release Gel. Because Advil targets pain at the source of inflammation. So for faster pain relief, Advil, the pain away. You know Harbor Freight.
Tim, Tom, welcome to the program. So look, the Ballad of Wallace Island, the great Richard Curtis has said this is one of the 10 greatest British movies of all time.
Yeah,
yes?
That was insane. Yeah. I would have preferred one of the 5, but I'll take one of the 5.
I know, one of is also
durability goes a long way.
Yeah, right.
He's probably got another 3 in there.
Is it a rom-com? Would you say?
Whatever you do it for us.
There are romantic elements to it. But it's
Patients who have sensitive teeth but also want wider teeth, they have
in many
to make
ways,
a choice, one versus the other.
The romance you're rooting for is probably more between mine and Tim's character in a way. But certainly, my character Herb and Kerry Mulligan's character Nell
Sensodyne Clinical White provides 2 shades wider teeth as well as providing 24/7 sensitivity protection.
What is the heart? And what's the story that you want to tell? If it's not a com or it's a rom or not, whatever.
We wanted to. Well, we made a short movie of this.
Those patients are going to love to see
we were telling a
Sensodyne.
very simple story of a guy who comes to an island and
they don't know each
Right,
other and they're
and
sort of feeling each
I
other
used to
out. And they
smoke.
kind of, I guess it's about friendship, really, or you know, seeing the best in one another. You know, he underestimates me, I'm too much for him, and eventually we find an even keel, and it's kind of very kind of loving. And I feel like that was our starting point for the feature, was we wanted to keep all of that and keep this nice relationship, central relationship between me and my little friend. And then we wanted to add some another dimension, some emotional kind of weight to it, and that's where Kerry comes in and sort of elevates it. And, you know, from the short, it's more kind of neat as a feature.
He's got just so, you know, after January Trump, I think some, I think, you know, obviously you were premiered it, it's not that, and the British film, and I think that was
there anyway, wondering how people would react. People were so nice about it, but that was the main thing they said, this is exactly the film. And I think it's probably because we weren't trying to make a film that was exactly right for our time. We weren't trying to fit it in anywhere. So it's sort of somewhere else there, and I think maybe that's what people want.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of pressure on filmmakers, on you know, writers generally, to make stuff that's very relevant, that's really into a certain kind of trend or sort of idea in culture. And I think because this film doesn't do that, I think people have been quite surprised and excited by just seeing something that just exists completely on its own terms.
So, of course, we saw the trailer in the introduction, but I want to leave you two to give me a précis of what this film is about. You start.
Okay, you can. So the idea of the film is that Charles here is a lottery winner who is a super fan of a group called Maguire Mortimer. And he arranges.
And you're wearing a t-shirt.
I'm wearing a t-shirt.
Maguire Mortimer.
Mega Flux.
So and I play Purple Guy.
They produce
and
water
Trey Mudman plays Nell Mortimer. And he arranges for the band to come together and play another gig privately.
We export more than half of our production to the United States.
So we,
and he doesn't tell you
now
that he's
this assembly line is out of manufacturing electric cars and buses. From what we do in Mexico, and it appears that U.S. President Donald Trump and Harris could trigger a global trade war.
The best way to deal with tariffs is to buy locally.
We did find that out later in the story. Yeah, that he's got his reasons.
He's grief-stricken, and there's an anniversary coming up.
You have an automotive industry and want to manufacture electric vehicles, sell them domestically, or look at South America.
The company makes these buses called Haru. It means Roadrunner in the local Yaqui language. It's the first electric bus manufactured in Mexico.
And, you know,
it's expected to run in Baja California.
Trying to do something in his
It's part of Plant Mexico,
We're
a
pretty much
program
in the
planned by
center
Mexican
of the old
president
city. For
Donald
anybody who's
Trump,
ever
giving
been
companies
to Seoul, this is
incentives to
right
invest
in
in
front of
domestic
Jumbo
production
Palace,
and generate jobs.
It's been here for
Creo que estamos
centuries, a
viendo.
gathering
I
point,
think
and
we're
this has been a gathering
experiencing
point
a
for people
situation that can possibly
are
be
routing
dramatic,
against
that having our own technology allows you to better manage
a lot of
your
people are
success as a
starting
country.
to leave.
Mexican companies now thinking of ways to expand domestically rather than across the border.
Close to the Constitutional Court and all the streets and alleyways that had not been closed down by police. So people here are having their after lunch sort of victory celebrations. And now what happens next is that we have all on our phones.
Senator Stephanie Turner was disqualified from the tournament after refusing to compete against her opponent, who she says is transgender. The official actually issued her a black card, which means she couldn't compete for the rest of the USA fencing sanctioned tournament at the university.
Listen to her reaction, what she felt when the verdict came down earlier today.
Maryland. Turner went on to Fox News to explain.
It's hard to describe, honestly. Excited, happy, but the moment the Constitutional Court said that he was impeached, I started bawling. I cried for 4 minutes, and I couldn't talk. And it was such a heavy feeling.
On principle. USA Magazine told CNN it enacted transgender and non-binary policy in 2023 to expand access to the sport of fencing and create inclusive safe spaces, and that the disqualification followed international federation rules because Turner, quote, declined consent when eligible. CNN is not naming Turner's opponent, who has not responded to CNN's request for a comment, and who has not publicly commented or disclosed their gender identity. If you're living with moderate to severe background,
the majority of South
or
Koreans said
arthritis,
sending in the
sometimes
military is
now
not
they're
how a
scattered
democracy
so you can
functions.
be
You
all
don't
in,
send
clear
troops
skin.
to
get rid of a political logjam and solve a crisis. So where we go from here, later in the evening, down one of these main avenues, this is where we're going to see a rally of anti-EU supporters, those who are thrilled with today's decision, 7 p.m. local time by City Hall. We're now headed towards elections in the next 60 days. That brings us around to June 3rd. The country's going to need to elect somebody who can go toe-to-toe with the Trump administration after 25% tariffs levied against South Korea yesterday.
There's nothing like
and we're back with more on the breaking news. A massive stock sell-off around the world today, including in the United States. The result of President Trump's tariffs. JP Morgan took the rather dramatic step yesterday of updating their assessment of the chances of a global recession. It went from 40% to 60%. That means it's more likely than not, JP Morgan's view, that the United States will experience a recession. Here, a screenshot from JP Morgan's memo yesterday shows the headline, quote, "There will be blood." With me now to discuss is the managing director and head of economic research, Bruce Kasman. Bruce, thanks for joining us. So what led you to take this dramatic step to revise the chances?
Tom, welcome to the program. So look, The Ballad of Walrus Island, the great Richard Curtis has said this is one of the 10 greatest British movies of all time.
Reasonably well.
Yeah.
That was in the first quarter, I think something.
Well, I was preferred one of the 5, but you know.
However, first and foremost,
I know, one of
saw
the
Liberation Day,
yeah,
really large tariff.
Probably got another 3 in
You should
there.
understand that a tariff increase is a tax on U.S. households and businesses. It's roughly 22% cumulative tariff increase we see. Would be the largest U.S. tax hike
in many ways,
since 1968.
the romance originally for it's probably more between mine and Tim's character.
Secondly, the design of the tariff
and Carrie
is
Mulligan's
not meant
character
to
now
tactically go
have rich
against
history,
unfair
and
practices
so
abroad.
there's the kind of
It's
will they
basically
get
putting
back
tariffs on
together.
countries based on their bilateral deficit
What's the
with the
story that
US.
you want to
And
tell
in
us? It's not
doing
a
so, what
calm
you're doing
with
is
the wrong or not
effectively
whatever.
creating a situation
We
where you're
wanted to,
targeting those
well,
things
we
that
made a
Americans
short
buy,
movie of this
regardless of the
18
cause of
years
that.
ago.
You're
So we were
creating
telling
an
a very
opportunity
simple
for
story.
large
A guy
disruptions
comes to an
and I
island
think significant
and
retaliation
they
as
don't
well.
know
And
each other and
perhaps
they're
as
sort of feeling
important
each other
as
out and they kind
anything,
of
we think what's going on
I guess it's
here,
about
not
friendship
just
really,
trade
or
policy,
you know, seeing the
but
best
other
in one
policies
another.
as well.
You know, he
We're seeing an
underestimates me,
administration
I'm
that is
too much
shifting
for
the
him, and
sentiment
eventually we
within the
find an
sector
even keel
away
that's kind of
from
very kind of
his view,
loving.
which I think was in
And I
place
feel like
at the
that
beginning of
was
the year.
our
That
starting
this
point for the
administration cared
future, that
about
we wanted to
near-term
keep
growth,
all of that
cared about the
and
business
keep this
sector,
nice
and that
relationship,
momentum
central
shift
relationship
in terms of
between him and
sentiment
his
is what's
friends.
reflected in
And then
markets
we
this
wanted
week.
to add
As
some
long as I have your
another
expertise,
dimension, some
ask
emotional
you
kind
to
of
explain
weight to
something
it,
for
and
viewers,
that's
because you
where
said
Kerry
that
Mulligan's
tariffs were
character
assessed
Nell comes in
in large
and sort
part
of
based
elevates
on the
it into,
trade deficit the United States
you know,
had with
from the
countries. So,
shore
for
into
instance,
something that's more kind of
if the United States
as a feature.
buys
It
$100
is
million
really that
a
we've got
year
just
of
so
goods
many
from
bits that
Wakanda,
are fligging
and
at
Wakanda
you, and
only
they make a
buys
really
$5 million
close
from the
ear
United
hole,
States.
and
That's
they
a
make you
huge
laugh, and they make
trade
you a little,
deficit.
you know,
But
teary,
it's not
and they make you feel
necessarily
good.
because of
And I
unfair
just
trade
wondered
practices.
whether
It might just be
I
that Wakanda
realized you
has
did
a
the first
fraction
shot
of the
18 years
population
ago, and
compared
this
to the United
clearly
States,
wasn't
right?
done, you know, after January 20th,
There's a
you know,
whole
where it
set
came
of
from.
things that
But
determine
does
what
it you
trade
feel the right movie
balances
for
are. I
the
mean,
time?
let me give you a very
Yeah,
simple
because
example.
we've had
Let's
a
say
lot
you
of
live in
people
a
go in
village,
touch with
and I'm
us
a
since the
baker, you're a
film came out
grocer,
in the
there's a plumber,
States,
so on and so forth.
saying
You
that
may
this was the
want
film
to
that they needed to
spend
see,
only
and
what
saying
you
like,
earn.
I
That
didn't
doesn't
know I
mean you're
needed
going
this
to
film, but this
spend
is such a kind of
with the baker
cathartic
and
thing for
the
me to see something that's
grocer
got
and
nothing
so
to do
on,
with what's happening
so that you have a
politically.
balance
Yeah,
of what
I
their
think
Some of them
spending
have you
view
even
is.
do.
Those things
I
just
think,
don't
you know,
have any real
obviously,
Because
logic
you put
behind them
premiered it at
in a
Sundance,
macroeconomic
which is
sense.
kind of
I think
overwhelming,
that's
but there were
truly
and that was
what
like
you
2 days
design
after
this
Trump's
tariff.
inauguration, so
President Trump posted on Truth Social today. Great
but
job,
we finished the
numbers.
film, and
Far better than
I
expected.
don't
It's
know,
already
but
working.
obviously it's kind of strange that it
We can't
wasn't
lose it. Just to
in
be
the
clear,
UK,
those
Japan,
job numbers
so we were there
are
anyway,
from
wondering what
March
people, how people would
before
react.
Liberation
But
Day.
people were so
So
nice
is
about it.
it
That was the main thing
an
they said.
accurate
It's
assessment
exactly
saying
the
it's
film.
already
And I
working?
think it's probably because we weren't
No,
trying
not
to
at
make a
all.
film
I
that was
would
exactly
say
right
that
for
there
our
is
time. We weren't trying to
job
fit it in
numbers
anywhere.
of an
So it's sort
economy
of
that
somewhere
turned into
elsewhere,
the
and I
new
think
year
maybe
with
that's what people
expectations
wanted.
relatively
a lot of pressure on filmmakers, on writers generally to make stuff that's very relevant, that's really tapped into a certain kind of trend or sort of idea in culture. And I think because this film doesn't do that, I think people have been quite surprised and excited by just seeing something that just exists completely on its own time.
The president also said this today, quote, the many investors coming into the United States and investing massive money, our policies. It's going to get rich richer than ever. Is this President Trump trying to appeal to people
And he arranged and I played Silverbright and Coleman plays now Walton. And he arranges for the band to come together and play another gig privately, just because they didn't tell us that he's invited the other one. So
stocks have been plunging for 2 days.
It's not my play, you know. It means that we think that one will be happy once they're there.
Verified on Facebook, verified on the Gram, verified on Threads, verified on LinkedIn.
Do something in his service that's kind of useful. The real thing is the old way that you have this is very intelligent things that the century is a challenge. And this is very important to people that I feel having a good skin, a normal thing that I'm going to go. And people are feeling really perception and these talented people who are credited in close to the constitutional court in all the streets and alleyways that had not been closed down by police. So people here are having their after lunch sort of victory celebration. And now what happens next is that we have all on a thrown in the towel to the former president, where he apologized and said, a word of thanks to his supporters. Yes, he did speak to anti-union demonstrator.
Prosperity for our country for decades.
And this is a very visceral
response to that, Canada
of
enacted reciprocal tariffs
It's all about martial law. This all goes back to December 3rd of last year, when
and
the now former president
Park
Newton to try to solve a political crisis, sent troops, members of the military, to the National Assembly, a couple kilometers away from the Parliament, and democracy in the name of, from this point of view, resolving a logjam, resolving a political crisis. But those gathered around us, certainly the majority of South Koreans, said sending in the military is not how a democracy functions. You don't send troops to get rid of a political logjam and solve a crisis. So where we go from here, clearly easily down to these main avenues. This is where we're going to see a very anti-union supporters. They were thrilled with today's decision. WTF time by City Hall, headed towards elections. Within the 60 days, that is around June 3rd, the country could need to elect somebody who can go toe-to-toe with the Trump administration after 25% tariffs levied against South Korea. Yeah.
Because we import a lot of American parts. And West Virginia, and we want those relationships to continue. So we are putting imports, and we're also putting tariffs on Mexican goods.
It's a rather dramatic step yesterday of updating their assessment of the changes of the global risk. It went from 40% to 60%. That means it's more likely than not that the United States will experience a recession this year. A screenshot of the memo yesterday shows the headline quote, "There will be blood." With me now to discuss is the managing director and head of economic research.
Yes, it's true that on Wednesday we didn't get any tariffs, but let's not forget the other tariffs we did. Parts tariffs are coming in, the tariffs on steel, the tariffs on aluminum products, and it's having a bunch of things.
I think
We used to have 91%
reasonably well. We moved to the first quarter, I think something seen today.
We're seeing it still.
First and foremost, what we saw with Liberation Day was an extremely large tariff increase. And we understand that tariff increase
so these are people consequences to these actions. And again, what we are looking forward to and hoping we will see soon is a comprehensive discussion of the administrative relationship, which is tricky.
Is there a spirit in which candidates
So we, again, under USMCA 99%, we have a tariff.
USMCA should note new national agreement between Canada and the United States and Mexico, which was President Trump.
Absolutely. And an important modernization. Different objective. The president has a transformation for trading relationships between the United States and trading partners. As he's implementing that transformational agenda, relationship we have
in large part based on the trade deficit the United States has with countries. So, for instance, the United States buys $100 million a year of goods from Wakanda, and Wakanda only buys $5 million. That's a huge trade deficit. But it's not necessarily because of unfair trade practices. It might just be that Wakanda has a strength in the population compared to the United States, right?
Had a discussion with the
there's a whole set of things that determine what trade balance is cost. I mean, I think, let me give you a very simple example. Let's say you live in a village, and I'm a baker, you're a grocer, there's a plumber, so on and so forth. You may want to spend only what you own, but that doesn't mean you can spend with the baker and the grocer and so on, so that you have a with their those things just don't have any real logic behind them in a macroeconomic sense. Being countries are designing this task.
President Trump posted on Truth Social today. Great job. Far better than expected. Love it working. They can't lose. Just to be clear, those job numbers are from March before Liberation Day. So is it an accurate assessment to say it's already working?
Suicide prevention can start.
No, not at all. I would say that there is a reflection of the job numbers of an economy that turned into the new year with expectations relatively optimistic that while the Trump administration would do some, fairly large changes in policy, that it would still be committed to supporting growth in the business sector. That, I think, is in the March numbers, and I think it's being lost now when we're making our way through March and April in sentiment and financial markets.
The president also said this is the choice of the many investors coming into the United States and investing massive amounts of money. My policies will never change. This is a great time to get richer than ever before. Is this a President Trump trying to assure people that there will be stability?
I think that to try to kind of interpret everything before we begin. And what I do want to say is that we sustain these policies for the rest of the year, and we will do damage to the U.S. and the global economy, and most likely throw the U.S. into recession.
Stocks have been plunging for 2 days. I mean, it's plunging. More than 2,000 point loss today. How long do you expect it to be going on? How long could it go? How low could it go?
Welcome to. I think that we are going into recession. We haven't seen the stock market. Stock market decline can be pretty substantial. I think the question to ask is whether there will be any correction in policies. I would want to emphasize here that the issue of tariffs to the U.S. money and the brand into higher inflation. We don't expect the Fed to come in very quickly unless there's some real breakdown in credit
world where
that the company
I'm not really including right now. Obviously, you can take a look at my portfolio for quite some time. And your portfolio, I suspect, you're not going to be deciding to do it every day. But who in like can afford to be patient about this? Who is being hurt by this?
It's telling us a very different story from.
Well, I think, again, the policies were announced this week. I think what we will see over the next 2 or 3 months, the U.S. inflation will have a 5% annual rate. I think that we will see a disruption in supply chain. I think it will become
more expensive for companies to source materials. And those things together, I think, will work both to spending, to the job market. And again, if we don't stay forth, I think really the elections in the session as we go through the rest of this year.
So let's do this on the side of the COVID. A small thing, first half, because it's in Canada, planning in the United States, because of President Trump's widespread tariffs, the Canadian Foreign Minister wants to the relationship with the United States will never be the same as comes on the heels of Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney on the morning. He sounded bold about the U.S.-Canadian relationship. Consistent with global trade interests from the United States, that Canada has relied on since the end of the Second World War, a system that, while not perfect, has helped deliver prosperity for our country for decades. As a response today, Canada enacted reciprocal tariffs against the U.S., enacting a 25% tariff on products and car parts, which we're going to discuss. Is the Canadian ambassador to the United States, Christian Hillman. Ambassador Hillman, always good to have you here. What do you think? A few weeks ago, your country was ready to shut off electricity to some American cities, but instead Canada chose to enact tariffs. Can you walk us through the decision making? Why you did this as opposed to something that might have been more consequential? Turning off the light.
Thanks, Becky, and thanks for having me. I think it's important for us to approach this moment in time in a way that shows Canada and Canadians and Americans that we always need to stand up for Canadians, but at the same time, it's important for us not to escalate to a point where we don't have an awful conversation the way I think. So we get to be enacted U.S. tariff on the goods that is with a few exceptions. So we actually aren't putting tariffs on because we import a lot of American parts from West Virginia, from Michigan, all over the place, and we want those relationships. So we are putting tariffs on automobiles imports. We are also not putting the tariffs on any Mexican components in those automobiles because Mexico has a tariff us. We are in the USMCA partnership. We want to make sure that we are not, inadvertently creating harm.
About the end, Instagram Live 6, Q&A, below. If you guys want to see, comment below. You can send me a message.
Well, yes, it's true that on Wednesday we can get a new tariff, but like we have tariffs on steel, we have tariffs on aluminum products, and it's having a consequence. We used to have 99% tariff-free trade a couple of months ago. Now it's 40% of trade between our two countries are under tariffs. You've seen it. Stellantis shuttered suspended operations. 900 Americans lost jobs because of that, and many more in Canada. So these are real-world consequences to these actions. And again, what we are looking for in community with soon is that comprehensive discussion around the Canada-U.S. trading relationship. So we, in the USFDA, 99% have a tariff-free.
That's the new minister, the new trade agreement between Canada, the United States, and Mexico. What President Trump
Absolutely. And an important modernization.
To the next video.
Another thing, a different objective. The president has a transformational objective for trading relationships between the United States and trading partners. As he is implementing that transformation agenda, the relationship that we have with the country, relationship is transformed. So those rules will actually, presumably along with it, we're looking to have that conversation. We're in an election period right now in Canada, so that more comprehensive conversation, the president said he will happen for our election.
And this is Taylor County, the source of President Trump is in touch with representatives from Vietnam, from India, from Israel to negotiate trade deals that could alleviate the situation in advance of the deadline next week. Given the idea if there's going to be a discussion with Canada and the plans to have those conversations.
So we're not in a position to be working towards it. We have had a discussion with the countries around starting a comprehensive and post the Canadian election, if whoever is in the leader of the future at the time. We look forward to that. And in the meantime, we would urge these streets.
Sorry about that. And Instagram Live real quick.
And that is not what we think to happen.
Very much a feature of the kind of economy Donald Trump is trying to create.
Going to happen in the trade space, which that's what the president wants. We'd like to see it able to minimize harm to workers in the United States and Canada.
All right, Ambassador Hellman, thank you so much. Really appreciate your time.
We all
American economy was always about the fact that didn't have to about the government that much. Regulation, lower taxes. What Trump is creating is an economy in which everyone is going to have to come to Washington to beg for a favor, for an exemption, for a special rate. It's really un-American. It is opposite of what the American economy is about. Without you're having to curry favor with politicians. So you're absolutely right. There is going to be inevitably questions of whether or not there was deal making, whether there was corruption. But it's the nature of protection.
Who have sensitive teeth that also want wider teeth, they have to make a choice, one versus the other. Sensodyne Clinical White provides 2 shades wider teeth as well as providing 24/7 sensitivity protection. Patients are going to love to see Sensodyne on the shelf. I used to think menthol cigarettes were other cigarettes because it didn't seem as hard.
It's Superman.
I have one at the age of 36.
July 11th. Anything you can
menthol cigarettes.
A Minecraft movie.
Welcome to both of you.
Next generation of
He's trying to grapple with. First to you, Prime Minister Marin, what do you say about Europe being slapped with these huge tariffs? And what do you think is going to be the result?
Isaac Larian,
we have been building multilateral
we spoke the other day.
international
I apologize. It was
and
Wednesday.
aiming to
The
free
president
the
was
trade.
walking out
Now
into
we're
the
entering the
Rose Garden
world
we were
where
talking to you. We had to
long
break off.
alliances
Were you as
have been
surprised or were
broken
you
or shattered
shocked when you heard
taken
the tariffs
in
are
many
coming?
ways between
Okay.
the US and Europe, and now the very, very sturdy tariffs against not only Europe but all over the world, and entering an age with trade wars is telling us a very different story than we were building for a long time. From European perspective, I would say it would be very important to stay united. I think that European Union countries are now discussing together how to encounter these tariffs, what will be the measures that Europe as a whole will take. And I think there will be a lot of discussion. Do we want to go to this path that Trump has chosen, or would there be some other response to this? I think that it would be very wise to also see a couple of days how things will evolve, and then make joint common decisions at European level and not by nation to nation. But I think that Trump also aims to have bilateral negotiations, not to negotiate with the whole.
But to avoid
so it's a bit of a divide and conquer. President Santos, I want to ask from your perspective, because one of the first crises, I guess you would call it, shortly after President Trump's inaugural, was with Colombia, when he, insisted on sending, plane loads of deportees in shackles. The current president was furious. He barred the planes from landing. Trump then slapped a 25% tariff on Colombia. Anyway, all these threats and etc. And then your president kind of walked the situation back, and these tariffs were not put on. So, from that perspective, as the Colombian president, former, what do you think your country and the Americans have learned about President Trump, and how do you advise dealing with it?
Absolutely impossible to make certain food in America.
Well, that incident with the Colombian president showed us that
sometimes when you're filling out your men's bracket, it feels a little bit like a roll of the die, right? But this year,
or with any president,
it's been all about that chalk, baby. What are we talking about? Well, we're talking about for only the
they use the methods that should be used from the beginning, which is diplomacy, private diplomacy, and dialogue. That is the way to settle things, to improve relations, not by using the tweet and insulting each other. That is the first lesson that we learned from that incident. And in general, I had the opportunity of being president with President Trump almost for 2 years. And we used private diplomacy to settle the disagreements that we had. And I think this is the way that should be done. And what we need right now in the world is more dialogue, more cooperation. Paris,
and in terms of folks who want their champions to go all the way, get this, nothing but good news. Bracket champions still alive, 65%. Folks who either picked the Auburn title, the Florida gave it, the Blue Devils, or, of course, my pick,
that was led by an Argentinian economist called Raúl Prebisch, and that was a complete failure.
That is the highest
that's why back in the early 90s, we
all died.
Would go and negotiating the creation of a World Trade Organization because the import substitution policy was a failure. We have existential threats that are increasing. The doomsday clock showed us how we have been getting closer and closer to doomsday, and we need to cooperate. And cooperation is based on trust and on constructive dialogue, and that is what we need right now.
Looking at the op-ed that you wrote, Trump's trade war on reality, you know, you're blunt and you use words you don't always use. You say capricious, destructive, and dumb way, talking about how close it is to American power.
Yeah, you know, this may be the biggest economic policy-making era of my life. I've never seen anything like it. And you know, you are seeing the verdict already in from the market. And the stock market is not the economy, but the stock market, the bond market, the commodity market, everybody is signaling that this was a disaster and it's going to be more pain to come. There's only two occasions I can recall when markets have gone so badly and so fast all at once. And that was the pandemic and the 2008 global financial crisis. But at least in those cases, those were genuine crises. Here you have an own goal.
On Friday.
It's amazing.
They can't do anything about it. CNN's Polo Sandoval has more on
Our
the fear being
country,
spread by the
that
Trump
according to
administration.
Cruz, the prosecutor in Washington, two countries where there are real estate projects going forward. I understand all the layers of the onion. It's hard to even think about that.
This is Salvador. I see no anybody is behind the wheel.
It's actually very much a feature of the kind of economy Donald Trump is trying to create. The more you have tariffs, the more you have these kind of blanket political decisions that govern the economy, the more businessmen have to curry favor with politicians. You didn't have to worry about the government that much. Light-handed regulation, lower taxes than in, say, Europe. What Trump is creating is an economy in which everyone is going to have to come to Washington to beg for a favor, for an exemption, for a special rate, whether you're a country, whether you're a company. It's really fundamentally un-American. It is the opposite of what the American economy is about. It's supposed to be, which is a free economy without you having to curry favor with politicians. So you're absolutely right. There is going to be inevitably questions of whether or not there was deal making, whether there was corruption. But that's the nature of protection.
I'll spend it all just to buy one thing, a phone call, to hear Cameron's voice again.
My
The
biggest
latest
question is why?
Weekly gets
Why would
Superman
you target
includes more
U.S. crimes
crypto than an
example
injured man
where
of
you
steel,
targeting the
the
Salvador?
fortress of solitude, and not just real Superman flies in the theaters. A Minecraft movie star, Jack Black, says he loves the game stirs kids' imagination. I'm looking forward to the next generation
Not his
of
personal
architects
concerns.
that grew up on Minecraft. Like, I bet you we have some insane building instructors that are going to be coming over decades to come. A Minecraft movie is in theaters now. In Hollywood, I'm David Graham.
A narrative of gang members.
Isaac, we spoke the other day. I apologize, it was Wednesday.
That's not who we are.
The president was walking out into the rose garden while we were talking to you, and we had to break off. Were you surprised or were you shocked when you
Children are
heard
scared
the
as well,
tariffs that are
and it's
coming?
really impacting their performance in
Thank
school.
you.
As a first generation Salvadoran American, Alma says she's formed bonds with my parents and her students dating from El Salvador. She recalls a recent conversation with a 7-year-old student.
She told me that she was very terrified that she would get deported. Her parents have told me that she is a U.S. citizen. She was born here, but still, it's like widespread fear that if you're Hispanic or if you're Salvadoran, you're going to get deported, right? Because of that racial profiling happening and that affiliation with MS-13.
Back in his own neighborhood, Benitez remains hopeful, and also fiercely protective of his community.
This is not the first time our communities have been under attack. We survived 4 years of the past being looted.
Almost about CNN, Prince George's County.
The impact of President Trump's tariffs is being felt all over the globe. The city of Lisbon is surrounded by South Africa, escaped the highest tariff despite being one
to
of the
avoid,
poorest
I know you've got
countries in
factories
the world.
elsewhere, and you
CNN's
can
Larry
shift
Manoa.
production to a certain extent, but to avoid
sewing
the
machines
work
whirl
of these
in a
tariffs,
garment
what
factory
can
in the
you
city.
do to mitigate?
But that's not the biggest buzz in this textile shop, which makes
we
apparel
have the
many
largest
popular clothing brands.
60-year-old
Workers say they're worried for their jobs after the U.S. imposed a
You may
50% reciprocal trade tariff on the tiny African nation, which could upend the students.
Vietnam,
Lesotho, one of the poorest countries in the world, and exports nearly half of its products to the U.S., which are mostly diamonds and textiles. So to be in the White House's highest tariff rate is a blow, especially for factories that supply U.S. brands like this Levi's factory.
This is crazy. They got me.
That's not now.
That's on whipped out right now. It's over. It's over. Comment down below.
Sometimes when you're filling out your men's bracket, it feels a little bit like